The door gives way. A man steps into a silence older than empires. Behind him, his legionaries, men who've stormed cities, crushed kings, bled oceans, now stand frozen. None dare follow. This is Pompey the Great, the hammer of the East, the purifier of seas, Rome's chosen blade. But here, inside the Temple of Jerusalem, the air is heavier than war. He's not conquering men, he's crossing into the realm of gods. And as his shadow falls across the sacred floor, the question trembles in every heart. What happens when a mortal defiles the divine? They begged him not to. The elders, the priests, even some among his own officers who feared omens, they all spoke the same words: "Do not enter." Before Pompey rose the temple, a mountain of white stone gleaming under the Judean sun. Around it the city trembled. Jerusalem, no marble like Rome's, no gold like Alexandria's, but something heavier, invisible, untouchable. Faith itself. Pompey had faced hundreds of kings, gods painted on banners, idols of bronze and ivory. But this was something else. There was no image of this god, no statue, no face, not even a name that could be spoken aloud. The Jews worshipped an unseen power, one God, invisible, indivisible. To a Roman, that was not holiness, that was arrogance. Still, the warnings came. "It is the Holy of Holies," they said. Even the high priest may enter only once a year, on the Day of Atonement, after cleansing himself with prayer and sacrifice. Anyone else who steps inside dies instantly. Pompey listened, silent. He had fought pirates who called the sea their temple. He had defeated Mithridates, who claimed to be divine. Yet none had frightened him as much as these priests trembling before an empty room. What sort of God kills those who enter his house? What sort of God hides himself in silence? He paced before the great doors of the inner sanctum, where gold curtains rippled like captured sunlight. Inside lay the ark's resting place, the centre of the Jewish world, the spot where heaven and earth once touched. Every soldier nearby held his breath. Even steel seemed to hum in fear. Pompey reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the veil. For a moment he hesitated. This was no enemy fortress. There was no glory here, no treasure Rome could carry home, only the chance to prove that divine terror itself could bow to human will. He looked back once. His men's eyes avoided his. No one wanted to see their general die for curiosity. And then he stepped through. No thunder, no blinding light, no divine hand striking him down. Only silence. Inside, the air felt different, thick, almost alive. The room was small, bare, the walls of cedar and gold shimmering faintly in the dim light. Pompey walked slowly, his sandals whispering across marble. His gaze moved to the centre, expecting a god carved in stone or metal. There was nothing, an empty space, no idol, no throne, only the void. Pompey froze. It was the first time in his life that victory felt like humiliation. The god of Judea had refused to meet him. When he emerged, the soldiers fell back, astonished that he lived. The priests collapsed in grief, tearing their robes. Pompey said nothing. He had entered the most sacred room on earth, and the heavens had answered with silence. That silence would echo for centuries. The story had begun long before that door opened. Judea had not been conquered. It had invited conquest. In Rome's eyes, the East was already tamed. Greece, Syria, Anatolia, all under control. Only Judea stood apart, small yet stubborn, ruled by the descendants of men who once defied empires. But by the 1st century BCE, that proud kingdom was rotting from within. Two brothers, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus those, sons of the Hasmonean dynasty, waged a civil war for the throne. One was weak and pious, the other ambitious and cruel. Both wanted Rome's recognition. Both sent envoys to the same man, Pompey Magnus. Pompey was then the most powerful general alive. He had crushed the pirates of the Mediterranean in 3 months, defeated Mithridates of Pontus, and redrawn the map of the East. His legions were undefeated, his name whispered like an omen. Wherever Pompey went, nations fell not from battle, but from awe. When the Judean envoys arrived, Pompey was in Damascus. He received them with the calm of a man used to hearing kings beg. Hyrcanus offered peace, obedience, and gold. Aristobulus offered defiance, but also greater wealth and independence. Pompey chose the weaker brother, because weakness could be controlled, strength could not. But Aristobulus refused to accept humiliation. He barricaded himself in Jerusalem, fortified the Temple Mount, and declared war not only on his brother, but on Rome itself. It was madness. Yet in Judea, madness was faith. Pompey's patience, legendary though it was, broke. He ordered his legions to march. The sight of the Roman army approaching Jerusalem was like an eclipse. Standards glittered. Siege engines rolled across the desert roads, and the sound of drums drowned prayer. To the defenders, this was not just war. It was apocalypse. When Pompey's scouts returned, they reported something strange. The defenders fought like men possessed, yet every seventh day they stopped. Pompey frowned. Stopped? Yes, General. They ceased to work, to fight, to even lift a weapon. They call it their Sabbath. Pompey's strategist smiled. Then we build on their holy day. And so they did. While the defenders prayed, the Romans built. While hymns rose from the temple, the battering rams inched closer. The heavens were silent. Stones and fire answered instead. By the third month, the walls cracked. Jerusalem fell, not from betrayal, but from devotion. To Pompey, it was proof of his destiny, that faith itself could be bent to strategy. To the Jews, it was proof that the Gentile conqueror had mocked their God, and as his army poured through the broken gates, Pompey did not simply see a city to subdue, he saw a mystery to conquer. The temple waited at the heart of the ruins, untouched, unburned, shimmering with quiet defiance. He would step inside not for gold, but for something rarer, for knowledge, for power. For the answer to a question Rome had never dared ask. Is there any God greater than man? The siege of Jerusalem became one of the strangest wars in Roman history, half battle, half ritual. It was not fought for territory or tribute or revenge. It was fought for pride. Pompey, standing on the ridge of Mount Scopus, watched as his engineers assembled towers, catapults, and siege ramps. Below him lay a city of priests and zealots, men who fought not for kings but for covenant. Each wall was a psalm, each arrow a prayer. Inside the city, Aristobulus had taken refuge on the Temple Mount. Around him, fanatics vowed to die before they would let a pagan touch the altar. The high walls of the temple shone like polished ivory, impossible to climb, impossible to burn. Pompey admired their resolve. He despised their blindness. He sent messengers, offering terms, surrender, clemency, protection of the temple. The answer came back in silence. Then a single arrow tipped with Hebrew writing struck the ground near his feet. It read, "No Gentile shall enter the house of God." Pompey's eyes hardened. Very well, he thought. If no Gentile may enter, then Rome will break the law of heaven. The siege began in earnest. Roman engineers constructed wooden towers high enough to overlook the walls, protected by mantelets soaked in vinegar to resist fire. Archers filled the sky with shafts. Stones from catapults shattered parapets. Still the defenders sang. Every morning they offered sacrifice. Every evening they prayed for deliverance. Their priests blew the ram's horn from the sanctuary, its cry echoing like defiance against thunder. To them, Pompey was not a general. He was a blasphemy given flesh. Weeks turned into months. Food dwindled. Corpses piled near the gates, yet no one surrendered. The Romans, usually efficient and unfeeling, grew unsettled. Even hardened veterans murmured that these people fought with invisible allies. Pompey did not believe in miracles, but he did believe in patterns, and he noticed one. Every seventh day the defenders ceased all labour. No repairs, no arrows, no stones hurled. The Sabbath. It was a fatal devotion. He ordered his men to advance the siege works every Sabbath, inching closer while the defenders rested in pious obedience. The temple walls, unbroken for centuries, began to tremble. Then came the final day. The battering rams struck the northern gate again and again until bronze cracked like bone. Roman soldiers swarmed through the breach, shields locked, spears forward. The defenders, priests, farmers, children, fought with knives, rocks, and faith. Blood ran down the marble steps of the temple courtyard. The altar was covered not with incense but with ashes and men's hearts. Pompey, calm amid the carnage, ordered the slaughter to stop once the inner court was reached. He had no desire to destroy the temple, only to see what power it truly held. When the fighting ceased, the smoke cleared, and the conqueror of the east walked forward alone. Behind him, the legionaries stood still. Ahead of him, the curtain of the Holy of Holies fluttered in the hot wind. For centuries men had spoken of divine wrath, awaiting any intruder. But Pompey's ambition was not one that fire or thunder could deter. He stepped toward the veil. The priests screamed. His soldiers crossed themselves in Roman fashion. Pompey the Great, Rome's living god of war, was about to challenge another god, one who needed no image, no army, no throne. He would not emerge the same. Aristobulus's rebellion had begun as politics, but it ended as prophecy. He had once been charming, educated, even admired in Rome's own circles. But ambition makes exiles of reason. When Pompey chose his brother Hyrcanus, Aristobulus could have accepted defeat, lived as a vassal king under Roman protection, perhaps even thrived. Instead, he turned the temple, the beating heart of Judea, into a fortress. To the Romans, that was unforgivable. Temples were to gods, not to rebels. Pompey saw Aristobulus's defiance as treason. His legions saw it as blasphemy. For months they starved, bled, and died against holy walls that refused to fall. Every loss deepened their hatred, not only for the defenders, but for the god who seemed to protect them. Inside the city, Aristobulus's rule decayed into desperation. Food ran out. The priests argued whether to fight or to pray. Some whispered that perhaps Pompey was an instrument of divine punishment, that the sins of the Hasmoneans had brought ruin upon Jerusalem. But Aristobulus would not hear it. He adorned himself in royal robes, stood before the altar, and promised deliverance. No deliverance came. As the final breach opened, Aristobulus fled. The temple, his sanctuary, became his prison. He hid among the priests, clutching relics and crying to the god he had betrayed. When the Romans captured him, Pompey looked upon him not with rage, but with contempt. "King of nothing," he said. Aristobulus was spared, for the moment. Pompey preferred humiliation over execution. He ordered him bound in golden chains to be paraded through Rome when the time came. But in that act of mercy, Pompey committed his gravest mistake. By turning Jerusalem's rebellion into spectacle, he turned faith into vengeance. The image of their king in Roman chains burned into Judea's soul, and the greater insult was not that their temple had fallen, but that their god had remained silent. In Roman triumphs, silence was victory. In Judea, silence was mourning. Pompey's entry into the Holy of Holies was meant to prove Rome's supremacy, but it achieved the opposite. For the first time, the people of Judea began to imagine resistance not through kings or priests, but through martyrdom. A seed had been planted, one that would outlast both Pompey and his empire. Years later, when the Zealots rose in revolt, when the temple burned under Titus, when Masada fell, they would remember that day, the day a Roman general walked where only God should stand. Pompey would go on to conquer more lands, win more titles, but nothing would ever match that moment when he stood before the void and found no answer. For Aristobulus, his downfall was simple pride. For Pompey, it was revelation. Because in Jerusalem, for the first time in his life, the man who thought himself favoured by every god met one who refused him completely. And the silence of that god would echo all the way to Rome. For 3 long months, the city refused to fall. The Roman machines of war groaned like beasts. Catapults hurled stones heavy enough to crush a man into the temple walls. The air stank of dust and incense, of blood and smoke. Every night Pompey climbed the same ridge and watched Jerusalem flicker in torchlight, half battlefield, half funeral pyre. He was no stranger to sieges. He had razed pirate strongholds, stormed Greek citadels, reduced cities to rubble. But this was different. Jerusalem did not fight like other cities. It did not fight to win. It fought to exist. The defenders shouted psalms over the screams of the dying. Women brought water to soldiers between volleys. Children carried stones for the ramparts. On the 7th day, the battle always stopped. The Sabbath, absolute rest, even as the enemy advanced. To the Romans, it was insanity. To the Jews, it was obedience. Pompey's generals warned him that breaking a people's god would break their spirit, but it might also bind their hatred forever. Pompey ignored them. He had begun to see Judea not as a province, but as a test. The ramp was finished on the third Sabbath of the siege. The defenders did not stop it. They couldn't. When the next sunrise came, the Romans pushed their siege towers forward, flames licking the wood as priests on the wall hurled oil lamps and curses. Trumpets screamed. Arrows blackened the sky. And then the walls cracked. The Roman legions poured in through smoke and rubble. Some fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the sight of the temple, a palace of gold and light rising from the carnage. Others shouted prayers to Jupiter for allowing them to conquer the house of a rival god. The priests fought to the last breath. They were cut down at the altar, their blood staining the sacred stones. And when the last defender fell, Pompey raised his hand. The killing stopped. The city was his. The soldiers expected plunder. Pompey forbade it. No fire, he commanded, no theft. This house belongs to gods, whichever ones rule here. The men hesitated. To leave a city unpillaged was unheard of. Yet something in Pompey's voice made even the most brutal centurion obey. He walked through the smoking ruins of the courtyard. Statues were toppled, scrolls burned, lives ended. But the temple itself still stood, shimmering through the haze. The conqueror of the East paused before its doors, the same doors that had once opened only for the high priest. Behind them, the Jews believed, lay the mercy seat of heaven, the very point where creation touched the divine. Pompey ordered them unsealed. His aides protested, "My lord, it is forbidden. Their God will strike us all." Pompey replied quietly, "Then let him." And as the doors swung open, the greatest general of Rome crossed into the unknown. Inside there was no roar of thunder, no divine flame, only stillness. Pompey's sandals echoed faintly against marble. The air was thick, ancient, as if breathing it were trespassing. He moved deeper, past golden walls and carved cherubim, until he stood before the place where God himself was said to dwell. And there, nothing. No statue, no altar, no throne, only emptiness. Pompey froze, staring at the void. The greatest sanctum on earth was empty. He turned slowly, searching for some hidden symbol, some relic of power. There was none. The Jews had built a temple for an unseen god, one who did not dwell in gold or image. To a Roman, this was heresy. To worship nothing was to defy everything. He waited, half expecting the air to ignite, for some voice to condemn him. But no lightning came, no sound but his own heartbeat. The silence mocked him. He thought of all the gods he had served, Jupiter, Mars, Fortuna, each with temples filled with offerings, statues gleaming in the sun. Rome's gods were proud, visible, transactional. You gave, they rewarded. You disobeyed, they punished. It was an order that made sense. But here, in the holiest place in Judea, there was only absence. Pompey felt something unfamiliar, unease. Was this not proof of Rome's superiority, that their gods still stood while this one hid behind emptiness? Or was it proof of something else, that power did not need to be seen to be absolute? He took a breath and stepped closer, his fingers grazing the smooth stone of the altar. The priests watching from the doorway cried out, tearing their garments, their faces wet with horror. To them, the Roman had become the very embodiment of desecration, the man who had crossed into the place where even angels feared to tread. Pompey turned to them, eyes calm. "Behold," he said softly, "the God of Israel." But his voice was hollow. Even he knew the words carried no victory. For what kind of triumph was this? To conquer a god who refused to fight. He ordered his aides to record everything. The dimensions of the chamber, the vessels of gold, the scrolls, the offerings. "Leave it untouched," he said. "Let it remain a wonder of the world." And then, slowly, he walked out. Outside, the sun hit his face. The soldiers stared at him, stunned that he still lived. "Did you see it, General?" one asked. Pompey paused. "Yes," he said, and there was nothing to see. That night he could not sleep. The silence of that chamber haunted him. For all his power, for all his victories, he had felt smaller there, like a trespasser in a place that belonged to eternity itself. Pompey had entered the heart of the divine and found no god. But in doing so, he had declared himself won. It was his most dangerous victory and the beginning of his downfall. When Pompey stepped out from the temple that afternoon, the light of the Judean sun felt strange. too bright, too raw, as if it were judging him. His soldiers knelt, expecting divine fire to strike him dead. But no such thing came. The conqueror stood alive, calm, untouched. Rome would call it a miracle, Jerusalem would call it a desecration. Pompey did not smile. He looked back once at the sacred hill, its smoke still rising, the cries of the priests still echoing. Something in him had shifted. He had spent a lifetime chasing glory, outwitting pirates, defeating kings, bending nations to his will. But here, in the holiest place of the East, he had seen power that required no armies, no monuments, no name. He gave the order, cleanse the temple, restore the sacrifices. The Roman banners were lowered. The surviving priests were allowed to wash the blood from the altar. The golden vessels Pompey had seen, candlesticks, censers, the treasures of the sanctuary were not taken to Rome. He forbade his soldiers to touch them. "They are not spoils," he said, "they are symbols." Then, with a tone colder than marble, he issued another decree. Hyrcanus shall remain high priest, but not king. The kingdom of Judea ceased to exist that day. From that moment forward, it was a Roman protectorate, its high priests dependent on Rome, its crown replaced by tribute, its people subjects of the empire they had once resisted through faith. Pompey left behind a garrison and departed for Damascus. To him the matter was settled. Another victory for the annals, another jewel in Rome's crown. But in Jerusalem, the silence he left behind was not peace, it was humiliation. For generations no foreigner had entered the Holy of Holies. Even the Babylonian conquerors centuries before had not dared to cross that veil. Pompey's entry was not just an invasion, it was an unhealing wound. The priests wept. The elders tore their robes. Mothers told their children the story not as history, but as prophecy. One day, a son of Rome entered the house of God and saw nothing. That is how the world began to end. And perhaps they were right, because from that day on, Judea would never truly belong to itself again. Rome would place puppet rulers, levy taxes, control its armies. But under the surface, hatred boiled. Pompey had conquered a city. But in the silence of that temple, he had awakened something stronger than swords, a defiance built on loss. He could not see it yet, but in the ashes of Jerusalem zeal was being born, a fire that would one day consume everything, including Rome's own peace. That night, as he rested in his tent, Pompey reportedly said to one of his aides, "I have seen their God. He sits upon no throne." The aide replied, trembling, "Then he sits everywhere." Pompey said nothing. For the first time in his life, victory had felt hollow, and history, as always, would remember the silence louder than the triumph. Pompey left Judea believing himself invincible, but gods, seen or unseen, have long memories. In Rome, the news of his triumphs reached the Senate, the East subdued, new territories secured, a general untouched by defeat. Statues were raised, laurels prepared, and yet something cold crept beneath the celebration. Rome loved heroes only long enough to fear them. The Senate whispered that Pompey was becoming too powerful, too divine, that he walked not as a man but as a king in disguise. And perhaps they were right. The man who had stood unburned in the Holy of Holies now believed himself chosen by fate itself. He built theatres in his own name, temples dedicated to his victories. When he returned to Rome in 61 BC, he staged the greatest triumph the city had ever seen. Processions of captured kings, mountains of gold, elephants parading down the Via Sacra. Among the chained prisoners walked Aristobulus the Kid of Judea, once proud, now broken. As the crowd roared, Pompey looked at the faces of his fellow Romans and thought he saw worship. But worship in Rome is never pure. It is hunger, envy, the prelude to betrayal. Within a few years, the alliance that had once ruled the Republic, the first triumvirate, crumbled. Caesar grew restless, Crassus died, and Pompey, the man who once defied heaven, could not defy ambition. His downfall began not with armies, but with pride. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Pompey hesitated. He had been the greatest general of his age, but greatness fades quickly in Rome. His soldiers no longer fought for him with the same fire. He retreated, fled south, and crossed the same sea he had once conquered, to Egypt. There, among the sands of another ancient kingdom, Pompey waited for refuge. Instead, he found irony. The Egyptians, fearing Caesar's wrath, decided to please the new power. On the shore at Pelusium, as Pompey stepped from his ship, an old Roman soldier approached him with a false salute. Pompey smiled, thinking he had found loyalty one last time. The dagger entered quietly. Pompey fell into the waves. The conqueror of the East, the defiler of the Holy of Holies, died not by gods, not by kings, but by a hired blade. His body was left half submerged, his eyes open to the horizon, as if still waiting for an answer that never came. When Caesar arrived days later, the Egyptians offered him Pompey's head in a jar. Caesar wept. Even he, the coldest of pragmatists, knew what it meant. The man who had once walked into God's sanctuary now had nowhere left to stand. Judea never forgot that defilement. Centuries later, Roman emperors would face uprisings that began with a single memory: Pompey in the temple. It became the symbol of all arrogance, of all desecration. Pompey's name was carved on monuments, but the act that defined him was carved on souls. The man who humiliated the god of Judea had finally met the truth, that no empire, no sword, no triumph could conquer the silence of the divine, and so he was washed away, not by lightning or curse, but by the tide of his own ambition. The gods of Rome demanded worship. The god of Judea demanded humility. Pompey had learned both too late. The sea that had once carried his victories now carried his shame. When Pompey's body washed ashore, the waves rolled gently over him, erasing the blood as if the world itself wished to forget. A fisherman found him and wept, not for the conqueror of the East, but for a man who had once believed he could defy both heaven and fate. Rome did not weep. It never does. The Senate that once hailed him as Magnus, the Great, now spoke his name in whispers. Statues that had once stood in his honour were draped in vines. Streets that once echoed with his triumphal marches fell silent. History has a cruel rhythm. It builds its monuments with applause and tears them down with forgetfulness. In the quiet years that followed, the story of Pompey became a parable whispered in both temples and taverns. In Rome, he was remembered as the general who reached too high. In Judea, as the foreigner who walked into the heart of God's sanctuary and found only silence. But there was something almost divine in that silence, for when Pompey entered the Holy of Holies and saw nothing, he saw the truth every empire fears, that no throne stands forever, and no man, however powerful, can summon the voice of God. His death in Egypt was not vengeance, it was reflection. The same Egypt that had bowed before him when he marched victorious through its deserts now offered him as a corpse to another Roman. A circle complete, a lesson finished. Caesar buried his rival's ashes with respect. He was once great, he said, and perhaps still is. But Caesar too would learn that Rome devours its own gods. He would follow Pompey into the same darkness, betrayed by those who once knelt before him. In the centuries that followed, the temple Pompey had entered would be destroyed. The Romans themselves, under Titus, would burn Jerusalem to the ground. The gold of that sanctuary would melt into the stones, fusing heaven and earth in one last act of defiance. The city would vanish into legend, but the silence of its God would endure. That is Pompey's true legacy, not the cities he conquered, nor the kings he humiliated, but the single moment when he stood in the holiest place on earth and realized power means nothing when the divine refuses to answer. He did not die struck by lightning, nor cursed by priests. He died the Roman way, betrayed by ambition, undone by his own reflection. But if you listen closely to the chronicles of his life, between the triumphs and the blood, there is a single pause, a silence deep enough to swallow an empire. That silence was the sound of a god no sword could touch. In the end, Pompey was not destroyed by Judea, nor by Caesar, nor by Egypt. He was destroyed by the question that followed him everywhere. What is power, if the divine remains unmoved? Perhaps that is why, centuries later, pilgrims still whisper his name at the ruins of the temple, not in hatred but in awe. For Pompey the Great, the man who entered where no mortal should, proved what no Roman Senate dared admit, that even the mightiest empires are built on borrowed time, and that silence, not thunder, is how the gods answer arrogance.